So, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to see so many of you. Obviously, we are just seeing your names, but we know that you are there. And welcome everybody on the 2021 Women and Gender Forum keynote lecture. It's a pleasure to be here, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Nancy Folbre for this lecture. So just to introduce myself, my name is Dorottya Sallai. I'm an assistant professorial lecturer at the London School of Economics and the chair of the Women and Gender Forum. It is my pleasure to welcome Nancy here today. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. So Professor Nancy Folbre is Professor Emerita at the Economics and Director of the Program on Gender and Care Work at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst, and the Senior Fellow of the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College in the United States. Her research explores the interface between political economy and feminist theory, with a particular emphasis on the value of unpaid care work. In addition to numerous articles published in academic journals, she is author of The Rise and Decline of Patriarchal Systems, the editor of For Love and Money, Care Work in the US, Valuing Children, Rethinking the Economics of the Family, The Invisible Heart, Economics and Family Values. She has also written widely for a popular audience, including contributions to the New York Times economics blog, The Nation, and the American Prospect. And if you would like to learn more about her work, then you can visit her blog and website, which is amazing. And it's called Care Talk. So you can find a lot of blog posts there as well. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Nancy. And today you will talk about capitalism and the care economy, which cannot be more timely during the pandemic, which doesn't seem to end anytime soon. So we are really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this amazing topic. Thank you very much again. And the floor is yours. Oh, just a little bit of introduction for the participants. We will have around half an hour lecture, and then we will have questions and answers. So please, if you have any questions coming up, post your questions in the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll get to all the questions at the second half of the hour. So thank you. Nancy, I'll give the floor to you.
I'm so happy to be here. This is really my first venture into the world of SASE, and it seems like a group that is less encumbered by disciplinary self-justifications than some of the professional groups I participate in. So I'm really looking forward to the possibility of exchanging some ideas with you. Let me just share my screen. I am going to be speaking about capitalism and the care economy. And really my goal is to persuade you that the care frame, the kind of emerging discourse of care, is really important, not just for understanding gender inequality, but also for thinking about inequality in general, for thinking about the meaning of capitalism, for thinking about the future of capitalism, and for thinking about economic theory and economic history writ large. So it's a very ambitious claim, and I'm going to stay at a pretty general level and leave time for specifics in the discussion. First, just to give you an outline of what I mean by this discourse, and then a little bit about the meaning of the care economy, emphasis on economy. I am by training an economist, and I really think it is actually important to bring that vocabulary to bear. So then a little review of gender inequality and care penalties. And finally, the really big question, can capitalism take the blame? And I'm going to give a more, I think, more nuanced answer to that question than a lot of people in this in this genre might give. So you've probably noticed a lot of discussion of care has become a really big word. 3 recent books, they're all really good. I don't agree with everything they say, but I find it really interesting that there's this kind of confluence, this outpouring. The Care Manifesto, Kathleen Lynch's book about to be released called Care and Capitalism, Emma Dowling's The Care Crisis. And it's pretty clear that a lot of factors have contributed to this efflorescence, as it were. One of those is just the fact that there are more women have moved into academic jobs and are drawn to the topic. But also, I would say on a global level, trends like below replacement fertility, the climate crisis, growing social problems related to opiate addiction and public health, and of course, COVID have sort of brought care to the fore. And I think it's a real opportunity to make progress, kind of really theorizing and developing the larger meaning of this approach. So what I mean when I say it offers a systemic critique is I think that a lot of this care literature argues fairly persuasively that there are aspects of capitalism, capitalist institutions that are eroding or undermining some aspects of care provision, that it seems that our economic system is dependent to some extent on the exploitation of undervalued or underpaid caregivers, predominantly, though not exclusively, women, that this is linked to increased inequality and also vulnerability. And it's also linked in a large way to environmental concerns, failure to protect or provide sufficient public goods, to take care of the commons. But it's also true that there's some very specific implications for economists and for economic accounting in particular, all of which are kind of moving forward in a slow but steady and I think ultimately successful way. Efforts to assign a market value to unpaid work, efforts to redefine income, to redefine investment, to redefine consumption, partly to accommodate the importance of unpaid work. A lot more attention to disaggregating the service sector and not treating it as a whole, but in particular noticing really important differences between care services and business services. And finally, emphasis on value capture, the ability to actually see, measure, and benefit from services that are provided, rather than value creation per se, which has always been kind of a primary concern of economics, is the, just creating stuff, not so much capturing the benefits of it. This kind of relates to the public good aspects that I'll come back to later in my talk. So care services are really distinctive from other economic services because they are, for the most part, really aimed to meet human needs rather than merely market demands. In textbook economics, demand is something that's expressed through the market. It's a relationship between quantity and price that's influenced by income. A lot of human needs are met outside the market and outside of the income price nexus. So that's obviously a big distinction. But it's also true that care entails a very distinctive labor process that involves and probably requires concern for the well-being of care recipients, personal attention, emotional attachment, and also team production, often collaboration between different providers and between providers and consumers or recipients of care. So it's not like your typical standardized commodity. And if you think about the output of care services, the output is also different, and it's also something that can't easily be priced. It's the production, the development, and the maintenance of human capabilities. At least that's the way I like to define it. And because human capabilities last a lifetime and are in a sense an investment good that yields a future flow of benefits. This is a process that has a lot of spillovers, externalities, and multiplier effects. So it's not just the person whose capabilities are enhanced that benefits, but everybody that person really interacts with or engages with, whether at home or at work or in the community or the polity. And if and when operationalizing to kind of our statistical infrastructure as expressed through labor force surveys and censuses, the care sector includes 3 industries that are typically considered part of the service sector: health, education, social services, plus care occupations outside these industries, although most care occupations are within those industries. But it also includes expenditures of time and money in families and communities. So it's unique, and it's the fact that it crosses the boundary of the market. And I think a key aspect of this paradigm is that the emphasis on some commonalities between paid and unpaid care work that make it important to consider them in concert, to consider them together. So you think about the care gender nexus, which is where a lot of the empirical research in this area has really focused. I think it's really useful to begin with a very big question. Is care work underpaid and undervalued because women do it? That is, it's a result of somehow devaluation or depreciation of the feminine and of women. Or are women assigned primary responsibility for care work because it's so difficult to capture its benefits? And I don't think the answer to this question is either or. I think they're both of those factors enter into kind of a circular process that reinforces itself over time. But in my work, I'm calling attention specifically to the distinctive characteristics of care services that make anybody that specializes in their provision, not just women, somewhat vulnerable to economic risk. So where do penalties for caregivers come from? Why have, what's our explanation of why they exist? Well, I think the story begins with gender. Historically, women's opportunities to specialize in anything but care work have been restricted, institutionally restricted for a very, very, very long time, in very extreme and inertial ways that have only, fairly recently begun to change. It's also true that commitments to provide care are almost by definition costly, and they reduce economic bargaining power. So once you begin a process of care provision, often you become somewhat attached to or connected to the care process. It's very hard to threaten to reduce your services if you're not paid more. And in fact, there's a kind of prisoner of love dynamic, or what economists would call endogenous preferences, that means that people who are caring for dependents often become in some ways dependent themselves, and therefore not in a position to have a very strong political voice or to have much economic bargaining power. And I think this is related to this importance of the disjuncture between private costs and public benefits. So for instance, it costs a lot to devote time and energy to rearing the next generation, but that process of rearing the next generation yields very important public benefits, and including fiscal benefits that are basically enjoyed by a very large and diverse set of people, including future generations down the road. So there's a lot of empirical evidence of several different kinds of care penalties, and we can discuss some of the details if this is something that some of you are interested in. A lot of research showing that time devoted to unpaid care work lowers lifetime earnings, increases risk of poverty. So that kind of flows very naturally from the observation that experience and job tenure are very much rewarded in the labor market. And so taking time out is often quite costly in terms of future wages, but also in terms of access to future benefits, including pensions. In the experimental realm, there have been some audit experiments showing that discrimination against women is accompanied often by discrimination specifically against mothers in the labor market. And of course, that's also somewhat related to women's care commitments, because employers are anticipating less committed or less long-term experience in the labor market, which may account, at least in part, for discrimination against them. And then there's also this literature, and this comes around to what I was saying about looking at similarities between unpaid and paid care. It seems pretty clear that workers in care industries and care occupations are paid less than others with the same education and experience. And there's, again, we can talk about the details. I would say the evidence is pretty robust and also somewhat international, but still emerging. There's still a lot to be done in this area. And I'm actively pursuing some empirical research in this area myself. So just to say a little bit more about devaluation and capture, I think economists make a distinction, like Warren Buffett here, Warren Buffett being a famous and very rich investor in the US, observing price is what you pay, value is what you get. And there's not always a consonance between price and value. And one of the determinants of value is whether you can actually measure and capture the value that's created. So just a very quick example would be a comparison of working in financial services, where your success is measured very easily in dollar terms, and in which highly paid workers at the top of the occupational distribution typically get a lot of bonus pay that's very directly related to the revenue that they've generated for the firm. That is not a pay model that works in care services for fairly obvious reasons. It's hard to measure the actual total value of improving, enhancing, maintaining human capabilities, and it's hard to get paid for it. So when we impute a value to unpaid work or to the value of health and education as part of the service sector in the global economy, we're just measuring inputs. We're not actually measuring outputs, because the output itself is not really susceptible to a market metric, and that's pretty has pretty momentous consequences. So who benefits? That's often kind of the bottom line question in political economy, and I think there is a pretty complicated answer to this question. Employers are benefiting because they're not paying the full cost of producing labor. They're just paying a wage that, kind of covers the, what Marx called the daily reproduction of the worker. Men are benefiting because women are paying a larger share of care costs, and that's true not just in individual households where women tend to be working longer hours in paid work and unpaid work combined, but also kind of in society as a whole, because women are financing the future to a greater extent than men are, because they're putting more time and energy into the investments into future generations. But it's also true and important not to forget that dependents, including children, sick or disabled people, and the frail elderly, are benefiting from a reliable source of care. And it's not really clear that you could provide for those dependents if you just relied entirely on altruism and sentiment. There's a lot of institutional infrastructure required to ensure that the needs of dependents are met. And I think that points us towards thinking more about the logic of patriarchal systems. And so I just want to talk briefly about my new book, which is called The Rise and Decline of Patriarchal Systems in Intersectional Political Economy. And it differs somewhat from the other kind of Care Manifesto, Care Discourse books that I mentioned earlier, because it really emphasizes that care penalties imposed on women really predate capitalism. I mean, by any definition, you know, markets, wage employment, whatever. And in fact, it argues that patriarchal institutions emerged because they forced women to specialize in care provision. They encouraged population growth, and they had some evolutionary advantages for the societies that adopted them in terms of competition with one another. And women in general paid a big part of the price for that kind of competitive success. So that leads me to a more to what I was describing as a more nuanced analysis of the impact of capitalist development on patriarchal institutions. I think it weakens them in some ways. It weakens, in particular, parental control over children. But it reinforces some other aspects, in particular, the offloading of care costs onto disempowered groups. But I would argue not just women, but a larger set of disempowered groups. And that's why I think, in a way, that noun capitalism, although I still use it, and I think it's an important noun, I think it's an oversimple construct, because it kind of implies that capitalism in the market is so hegemonic and so separate and so unrelated to the processes of reproduction that it ignores the complexity of the social institutions that govern investments in human capabilities. And as a result, it doesn't give us a very good understanding of the welfare state. It treats the welfare state as though it's just a political struggle over a family wage, when in fact it's much more than that. It's an effort to kind of reorganize and improve both the efficiency and the equity of the distribution of the costs of social reproduction. A very partial and not very successful effort, but one that I think is still evolving in some pretty uneven but very interesting ways. So I think the crisis, to me, the real crisis of care really has to be linked to the environmental crisis and the climate crisis. And I think instead of talking about things like social capital or human capital, we should be talking about the social climate and seeing our social climate as something that we really rely on to take care of ourselves. And that social climate is very vulnerable to disruption and to dysfunction. And the care crisis, like the ecological crisis, is really kind of a function of the growing importance of negative spillovers from market dynamics. The very success of the market has, in a way, been purchased at the cost of the depletion of some natural resources and the exploitation of some social resources, including efforts to offload the resulting costs and risks onto other groups. And that's what leads me to a kind of more intersectional approach. And in a way, this is the core argument of my book, that the distribution of the cost of care is a focal point of collective conflict and bargaining based on gender, age, on race, ethnicity, and citizenship, as well as class. So who's going to let who into their country? Who's going to let who into their educational system? Who's going to let who into their healthcare system? How are those costs of developing, producing, maintaining human resources going to be distributed? And we can see a lot of different forms of inequality there. And we see that they're intersectional in the sense, the very important sense, that many people are in contradictory positions. That is, they benefit in some ways from the existing configuration of social institutions, and they're disadvantaged in other ways by them. And that kind of overlaid pattern of hierarchical advantage and disadvantage, I think, makes the overall system very resistant to change. And in a way, if you think about it, I mean, this is a way of kind of restating what could be construed as a traditional Marxist or even Leninist argument about the aristocracy of labor. That is that, the idea that the working class in advanced capitalist countries enjoys such privileges from its position in a rich and successful country, that it's reluctant to challenge the social relations of production that put it in a disadvantaged position within that country. In a way, this is kind of a generalization of that point. And I think it goes a long way towards explaining why gender and race and citizenship have become increasingly important kind of vectors of political activism along with class. And it certainly suggests that coalitions, the development of coalitions, in particular coalitions around the organization of both paid work and reproductive work are really key. And that these coalitions are one of the driving forces of political change, the political change that we're living through in this kind of historical moment. So I'm going to end. I just wanted to end with a little aside about the logic of capitalism, which I think is really important to understand and does have some pretty significant consequences. In particular, you see this language of care has been adopted and in many ways co-opted and appropriated as sort of a signal of trust, a signal of confidence, a signal of trying to hold things together in a viable way, so that I actually have a much larger collection of business slogans used in advertising that invoke the word care. And this phrase, "we care," has been trademarked. So it's actually intellectual property. And also the phrase, "we care more," has been trademarked officially. And "we care about you completely" has also been trademarked. I don't think the phrase, "I don't believe you really do care about us completely," has yet been trademarked, but that's the that's my catchphrase. I think we should view these claims with some skepticism, because care is quite costly, and a lot of care is offloaded onto people with the fewest resources to provide it. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to any questions or comments you might have. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can look you in the eye.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. And there's so much to discuss today. So we already have the first question from Sarah Ashwin, who was actually one of the biggest mastermind behind this lecture today. So thank you, Sarah, for your question and also for being here. And an active participant in the Women and Gender Forum, a committee member as well. So thank you for posing the first question. So Sarah says, I don't know if you see the question, Nancy, but I will read it out. Thanks for the fascinating talk. How can caregivers go about capturing the value of care? Is it possible? Thanks so much.
Yes, that's a great question. It is possible. I think caregivers can go about that by really demonstrating the public benefits that derive from care work. And I think social scientists can contribute in some really important ways to that larger effort. But it's not easy. And it doesn't entail a kind of the paradox that I emphasize, that some work can be very valuable, but very hard to value in very specific terms. But I think this is why we see the coevolution of families and the state along with the market. That, I mean, economists have recognized for a long time that markets are not the only institutions that economies rely on. But I think we've lived through an era of kind of neoliberal economic theory that has forgotten a lot of the insights of earlier welfare economics, and going back and reclaiming some of that language of social welfare and measuring social welfare, and moving away from gross domestic product as an indicator of economic success is a really, really key aspect of this. Looking at, trying to estimate the cost of social dysfunctions and think about which countries are more successful than others in reducing things like opiate addiction, improving public health, improving educational and mental health outcomes, so forth and so on. So there you go.
Thank you very much. Very good. So for the participants, I just would like to raise your attention to the Q&A box. So if you would like to ask a question from Nancy, then please post your question in the Q&A box and I will read it out. Thank you, Petra. So Petra Sower asking or saying, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. Do you know about any evidence on the extent to which the reclassification of care education to the tertiary level had a positive effect on the wages earned in the care sector? Was it clear? Or?
No, Petra, I don't quite understand what reclassification of care education you're referring to, and it may be something outside the US context, so I just need a little more clarification.
Yeah, okay, let's, if Petra, if you can type in a little bit more specifications in the questions, that would be great. In the meantime, I turn to David's question, David Jed Schwartz. If capitalist economic systems cease to minimize where even possible all or most forms of work compensations, are those systems still quintessentially capitalist?
That's a great question. I mean, from a Marxian perspective, absolutely not. Accumulation, that is Moses and the prophets. But that's why I think that's why I'm sort of dissatisfied with the whole capitalism construct. I think if you assume that everything in the world is a capitalist system, and everything is capitalist, then the word capitalist loses its meaning, I think. And I think as a system, capitalist institutions are evolving in a larger ecology of patriarchal institutions, nationalist institutions, and racist institutions. And sometimes that's intensifying capitalist exploitation, and sometimes it's kind of weakening it. So I just favor this more decentered approach that preserves a role for class conflict, but sees it as very much mediated by other dimensions of collective conflict.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Please, I just would like to remind everybody to use the Q&A box, but we still have one question in the chat box, and I will aim to read this out as well. So from Stefan Kensting, University of Leeds. Do we need a revamp of the efforts around the comparable worth debate? Thank you, Stefan.
Yeah, Stefan, I think that's a very discerning comment. This is absolutely kind of a reworking of the comparable worth argument, and insisting that the main problem with comparable worth is that market forces are not valuing, and market ideology is just not valuing some really important components of social value on which the larger economy depends. So that kind of comes back to Sarah's point, that we have to figure out some ways of assessing it. We may not be able to measure it precisely, but we need to move away from just ignoring that social value is a really important determinant of what people should and could be rewarded for their efforts.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. So we've got a few more questions coming in the chat, or the Q&A. So please write the questions, really amazing questions. Lucilane Morandi, care is in evidence now with the pandemic. We have found that caring is an essential activity for a better quality of life. The question is, what can be done to reduce inequality between gender and workers related to the care activities?
I think there are a lot of different policy levers that have to do with trying to increase wages for care workers, particularly at the bottom of the distribution, by regulatory means like a higher minimum wage. But also I think it relates, the question also relates to questions about a universal basic income and whether a universal basic income could be designed in a way that would empower workers devote more time to family and community without reinforcing gender roles. So there are a lot of, none of these paths are really easy, and they all kind of have some potential pitfalls. But I think a lot of people are thinking about different ways of addressing them. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. The next question is from Sonia Avlias. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk, Nancy. Could you reflect on the global care chains and how migration of care workers to the richer economies is exacerbating core periphery dynamics of the global economy? Very
good point. This is what I'm getting at when I say that citizenship is a really important dimension of collective conflict over the distribution of the cost of care. And it is fascinating that there is this completely global dimension to the care economy. It's not something that's just can be understood in terms of an individual household. I think it's possible. I don't want to sound optimistic, or I don't want to sound too optimistic or unrealistically optimistic, but one of the things that's happening on the global level is a transition to below replacement fertility rates. And I think that it's going to increase the demand for care workers in the now affluent countries. And I'm hoping that that could have the impact of increasing the bargaining power of care workers in general and migrants in particular. And I think a key area for activist commitment is in trying to improve the rights and kind of bargaining power of migrant care workers, and really take seriously the responsibility of rewarding them in a equitable way for the work they do, and also considering in a more serious way the impact on countries that are sending these migrants to service rich countries, and confront kind of the difficulties of ensuring that they don't suffer from a care deficit as a result.
Thank you so much. So the next one is from Petra Sawyer. In some European countries, education to work in the care sector, for example, in teacher education, has been reclassified from the upper secondary level to the tertiary level. So I was wondering about the wage effects related to this.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think probably labor economists have looked at that in the European context. And in general, I would expect more credentialization and more emphasis on educational attainment to improve wages. But I don't think that's enough. And in the US case in particular, it's sort of problematic because access to tertiary education is so restricted financially in the US that credentialization potentially really actually worsens inequality in the care economy. But that said, I think thinking more about the educational credentials of care workers is a really important and useful strategy for sure.
Thank you so much, Nancy. The next one is from Nancy Di Tommaso. At the same time that we have a growth of precarious work, major international companies are talking about talent management, empathy, and their service to their employees. It seems that major companies are also now claiming to care at the same time that they participate in a system that undermines the social safety net. Can you talk a little bit more about these contradictions? Is it only ideological, or are there structural dimensions as well?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think that this sort of comes back to the slogans like "we care more," "we care," completely. And this is the paradox of care. Care actually holds things together. It enables cooperation. Anytime that you're trying to get people to cooperate, like in a firm or in a community, encouraging care connection and care provision is really good. But it's always to your advantage to draw a line around those you care for, so that care becomes more like an insurance system that's just helping everybody in the group, but not including people that most need the insurance. If you let them into your system, they're just going to increase the costs. So, a lot of corporate family policies, for instance, are basically aimed at high wage workers, because they don't want those high wage workers to leave the firm because they're going to suffer economic costs as a result. So, you could think, this actually relates. I don't know if there are any economists out there that are interested in this connection, but a lot of public choice theorists like James Buchanan talked about club goods. And club goods are basically public goods that are appropriated by a small group rather than a big group, like a country club with exclusive membership. If you belong to a country club, you experience a lot of care. You have a lot of benefits. It's really great. People help each other out, but there's strict barriers to entry, which means that it's not very costly to provide that care. So this is what is so useful, I think, about the care discourse, is to see that conflict is not just about, it's not just about conflict over exchange or over expropriating surplus value. It's also over kind of access to care, access to a collective commitment to care, and the incentives to exclude the neediest groups from that access.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Nina Bandai, next question. Thank you so much for this presentation. What may be some positive developments in capturing the value of care, perhaps in the aftermath of the pandemic? Are there examples in the right direction to give us hope for a change?
Yeah, well, there definitely are in the United States. We've seen a political coalition, a very profound shift with the Democratic Party really beginning to identify itself as committed to increased public care provision and quality as well as quantity of care provision, and not just provision of public services, but also support for family care through an expanded child tax credit. And I do think this is a response to the external shock of the pandemic. And the problem is, it requires, external shock isn't enough. You have to have a coalition. You have to have the conditions that are necessary to develop a political coalition that can mobilize around it. And that's a process that all of us are trying to understand better. And, the world is our laboratory. I guess what we're seeing a lot of variation emerge. So we have to point to the positive examples and try to make a case for stronger coalition building around increased care provision.
Perfect, thank you. Yuan Wu. In a broader meaning, this is more than a gender issue, I think. Men working excessive long hours, such as in East Asian countries, is an evidence of the society devaluing men's caregiving time to family and community. Wondering if you have any comments on this.
Yes, I think that is really key. And you really, this has really come to the fore in public policy discussions in South Korea, where they've implemented a lot of ambitious reforms in childcare and family leave that have had relatively small effect in a work regime where men work really long hours. And in some ways, I think the length of the working day may be a greater obstacle to improving the care economy than any other part of the policy puzzle. And I think to really some really significant changes in both the temporal and the spatial organization of paid employment. Yeah.
Thank you. Lucilene Morandi. Sorry, I have another question. Please don't say sorry. Please ask questions. It's really, that's why we are here, and we still have 15 minutes, so just go on with the questions. Very good. I'm an economist, and I tend to think that economic theory would play an important role in changing how we treat care when it comes to production and economic growth. What can you say about this?
I could say a lot, but Lucilene, I'm sort of interested in your thoughts. about it. So if you don't have a chance to tell me, you'll have to email me. But I think there are a lot of concepts in the economics vocabulary that are really relevant. Public goods as externalities is one of them, and bargaining power is another. I think that that, you know, in a sense, what my work is doing is sort of generalizing household bargaining models to society as a whole. So I've seen a lot. I feel like I've seen a lot of progress in my discipline. I mean, I've actually been surprised by how much the younger generation has moved in new directions in the economics profession. I also think that team production is really important, and that's something that economists have thought about for a while, and you know, really comes into a lot of discussions of industrial organization and other stuff. And team production is really, it's so central to the care economy, because it's not just that, for instance, teachers are working with other teachers or with parents. The really key aspect of the educational process is the collaboration between teacher and student. If the student is not motivated, if the student doesn't want to learn or is not in a position to learn, that the teacher can do nothing. So it's, you can't really assess the marginal product of a teacher unless you can sort of control for every aspect of the student. And likewise in healthcare, and surely the public health crisis that we're going through illustrates this point. You know, you can have a lot of really great public health measures like vaccination, but if you can't get people, if people won't cooperate with them, if they won't collaborate in the process of producing public health, you're nowhere. So this is why it's so different than producing a standardized commodity. It's just totally different. And it really relies on a lot of kind of interpersonal dynamics that I think economists need to pay more attention to. So I'm very encouraged that you asked this question. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nancy. So while we are waiting for more questions, I've got a question for you as well. So I would love to hear a little bit more about bargaining power of care or care workers, because, for instance, in the pandemic, we've seen that you know, healthcare workers were crucial in getting us through the pandemic. We've seen how important they were, and we call them key workers, and we were clapping for them, and we were, you know, thanking them in every possible way. And yet I see that the bargaining power of healthcare workers did not really increase, because in some countries that I know, for instance, in the UK, you know, there was not really a pay rise. We had a lot of controversy about the pay. In other countries, they had even worse conditions after and during the pandemic. So, you know, that goes against my assumption that a pandemic like this, a crisis like this, would maybe increase the bargaining power of these workers, but it doesn't seem so. And why is that?
Well, there is a lot of variation across countries in the extent to which bonus pay and hazard pay were provided, because I've actually worked with a couple of co-authors on a comparison of policies in the US, Germany, and Canada. And while it's true that none of those countries really provided very much, Germany and Canada provided like roughly more than 5 times as much as the US. So it clearly depends a lot on political coalitions and also on kind of particular economic institutions that are involved. And it's true that essential workers or system relevant workers, as they're known in Germany, you know, got a lot of, you know, cheap praise without pay benefits. But part of this was due to the, you know, to what I called in my talk the prisoner of love. You know, the professional norms in nursing and teaching discourage the use of threats to gain higher pay. So yes, sometimes you see strikes in nursing and teaching, but you see many fewer strikes than you would see if these workers were not in some very fundamental way committed to public service and identified with public service. And I think that goes a long way towards explaining why we haven't seen a more substantive increase in bonus pay. I mean, by the logic, I mean, just to go back to Lisa Lynn's question about economics, I mean, in theory, workers facing a higher risk of contagion should have been able to demand higher wages as a compensating differential. And the fact that they weren't is just another indicator of how the labor market doesn't work the way it's been depicted in textbooks. And there's just a tremendous amount of political inertia involved in the process.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Very good. Okay, any other questions from the audience? Because we are coming at the end of the hour. And if there are no more questions, then I might round up the talk. Nancy, is there anything else that you would like to add or highlight that maybe you couldn't bring in through the question?
I was advocating a shorter workday, and now I'm enabling a shorter work hour. So
Okay.
I really enjoyed talking exchanging ideas. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and
thank you so much for coming. It was such a pleasure to hear you, to have your thoughts about this very important topic that we are thinking about every day as women in a pandemic. So I thoroughly enjoyed learning about these issues a bit more. And thank you so much for the participants as well, for the amazing questions and the very active participation in this very weird online format, but you made the most of it, and we are really grateful for that.
yeah.
So thank you so much, and thank you, Nancy, for coming.
Yeah.
And I wish you a great evening or rest of the day wherever you
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, thanks for organizing. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the whole Women and Gender Forum and the committee for organizing this as well. Thank you so much. Bye.